My name is Simone, and I am 34 years old. At a seemingly normal family breakfast, I caught my husband slipping a lethal dose of poison into my food. My heart stopped completely, but I kept my face entirely blank. When a sudden distraction turned their heads, I swapped my bowl with my father-in-law. Exactly 10 minutes later, the unthinkable happened. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you have had to outsmart people who wanted to destroy you. Survival requires paying attention to the smallest details. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in our $7 million estate in Potomac, Maryland. The sun poured through the windows of our massive gourmet kitchen, illuminating the white marble countertops. I was standing by the island adjusting my silk blouse. I am the chief executive officer of a top-tier commercial real estate firm, and I had a crucial board meeting that day. Everything appeared perfect. My husband Tavon was standing a few feet away preparing our breakfast. He was whistling a soft, cheerful tune. From the outside, we looked like the ultimate power couple, but appearances are often nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. As I smoothed down my sleeve, I glanced up. The surface of our black stainless steel espresso machine was polished to a mirror finish. In that curved reflection, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. Tavon had his back to me, but his hands were busy over my bowl of stone-ground grits. He pulled out a small glass vial and emptied a fine white powder into my food. He took a spoon and stirred it in thoroughly. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. The powder had a distinct, slightly oily texture. I recognized it immediately, having spent my life avoiding it. It was highly concentrated, macadamia nut extract. I have a lethal anaphylactic allergy to macadamia nuts. A dose that size would swell my throat shut and trigger a massive heart attack before an ambulance could arrive. My own husband was actively trying to murder me in our kitchen. Panic screamed through every nerve in my body, but my business instincts took over. I forced my breathing to remain absolutely steady. I kept my face entirely blank. I knew that if I reacted now, he would know I saw him. I desperately needed to survive the next 20 agonizing minutes. I smoothed my blouse one last time and put a very calm, gentle smile on my face as I turned around. Tavon picked up the bowls and carried them into the formal dining room. I followed him, my legs feeling like lead, but my steps remaining perfectly even. He set my bowl down in front of my usual seat and placed his own directly across the table. Then he leaned down and pressed a warm kiss against my cheek. He told me he made my favorite breakfast, because he knew I had a stressful day ahead. The sheer audacity of his affection made me want to be sick, but I simply smiled and thanked him. Sitting at the head of our long dining table was my father-in-law, Judge Rowland. He was a retired federal judge in the District of Columbia and a man who demanded absolute respect. He was already halfway through his own breakfast holding a cup of black coffee and lecturing us loudly about family legacy. He was going on and on about how wealth must be protected and how bloodlines are the only things that truly matter in this world. I nodded along, pretending to absorb his arrogant speech, while my eyes stayed fixed on the bowl of poisoned grits, sitting just inches from my hands. I needed a distraction. I needed just one moment of chaos, as if the universe heard my desperate plea. The heavy oak front doors flew open. My brother-in-law Darnell and his wife Keisha barged into the foyer. Darnell owned a string of shady nightclubs downtown, and he was always bringing his chaotic energy into my home. He and Keisha were arguing at the top of their lungs about a missing credit card. Their voices echoed through the high ceilings, completely drowning out the judge's lecture. Judge Rowland slammed his hand on the table and turned his head to yell at them. Tavon immediately spun around in his chair to see what the commotion was about. It was the perfect diversion. They all had their eyes on the foyer, without making a single sound. I reached across the polished wood. In one fluid 2-second motion, I grabbed my poisoned bowl and slid it directly in front of Judge Rowland. At the exact same time, I pulled his half-eaten bowl of plain grits over to my placemat. My hands did not shake. The bowls made no noise. By the time Taven turned back around to face the table, I had my spoon in my hand. I scooped up a bite of the safe food and put it in my mouth, chewing calmly. Taven watched me swallow. A sickening gleam of anticipation danced in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought he was watching me consume my own death. I met his gaze and smiled, telling him the food was absolutely delicious. The next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Darnell and Keisha stopped yelling and took their seats. My mother-in-law, Celeste, glided into the room wrapped in a silk robe, complaining about the noise. The conversation shifted to upcoming social events and charity galas. I continued to eat my breakfast with measured bites, keeping my posture relaxed. Judge Roland picked up his spoon and enthusiastically dug into the bowl I had pushed in front of him. He was eating the exact meal his son had prepared for me. I watched him swallow, bite after bite of the deadly macadamia mixture. Exactly 10 minutes later, the poison took effect. Judge Roland was right in the middle of a sentence boasting about a recent golf tournament when he suddenly stopped. A harsh, ragged wheeze escaped his lips. His eyes widened in absolute terror as he brought both hands up to his neck. He tried to draw a breath, but his airway was rapidly swelling shut. The color drained from his face and was quickly replaced by a violent shade of purple. He knocked over his coffee cup, sending dark liquid across the white tablecloth. He stood up, clutching his throat, trying to force air into his lungs. Then his knees buckled. The federal judge collapsed onto the marble floor, crashing down heavily. His body began to convulse violently. Pandemonium erupted in the dining room. Celeste shrieked and dropped beside her husband, crying frantically. Darnell shouted for someone to help while Keisha backed away in shock, covering her mouth. I looked at my husband. Tavon was standing completely paralyzed. His face was ashen, stripped of previous color. His eyes were wide and filled with sheer, unadulterated terror. But he was not looking at his dying father. He was staring directly at my perfectly empty bowl. He knew exactly what had happened. He realized the fatal error, but could not speak without confessing to his murderous plot. Amidst the deafening screams and the chaotic scrambling of my in-laws, I remained intensely focused. While no one was looking at me, I discreetly picked up the spoon Tavon had used to stir the poison. I grabbed a cloth napkin and swiped a tiny smudge of the lethal grits from the rim of the bowl. I slipped the spoon and the napkin into the pocket of my slacks, then I dropped to the floor, beside Celeste, and began my performance. I let out a convincing sob, letting my voice tremble with panic. I pulled out my phone and dialed emergency services, screaming to the dispatcher that my father-in-law was having a massive medical emergency and that we needed an ambulance immediately. I played the role of the terrified, devoted wife, flawlessly projecting absolute hysteria while my heart beat, with cold, calculated precision. Within minutes, the blaring sirens pierced the quiet morning air of our neighborhood. Paramedics rushed through the front door, with their equipment working frantically to stabilize the judge. They strapped an oxygen mask to his face and hoisted his unresponsive body onto a stretcher. As they began wheeling the comatose judge out the door to the waiting ambulance, the reality of the situation hung heavily in the air. Tavon stepped close to me. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he reached out, trying to grab my hand for comfort, or perhaps to gauge my reaction. I pulled my hand away, just enough to break contact, leaving him grasping at empty air. I let him wonder if I knew the truth, setting a terrifying game of psychological warfare into motion. We arrived at Johns Hopkins Hospital in a chaotic blur of screeching tires and flashing lights. The sterile waiting room of the intensive care unit was suffocatingly bright, smelling of bleach and stale coffee. I sat quietly on a stiff vinyl chair, keeping my hands folded perfectly in my lap. My mother-in-law, Celeste, paced the length of the waiting area like a caged predator. Her silk robe had been swapped for a designer trench coat, but her fury was unmasked. She glared at me, her eyes burning with an intense, irrational hatred that she no longer bothered to hide. "You brought this on us!" She hissed, her voice echoing off the pale green walls, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You and your cursed new money presents. Before you forced your way into this family, my husband was healthy. "You are a parasite, Simone. You drain the life out of everything you touch." I kept my expression completely neutral, casting my eyes downward, in a display of manufactured shame. Inside, my mind was calculating every variable, but outwardly I played the role of the terrified, meek daughter-in-law perfectly. Darnell and Keisha stood by the vending machines, nodding in agreement with Celeste, muttering under their breath about how my background was an insult to their historic District of Columbia lineage. They needed to feel superior. They needed to believe they held all the power in this room. I let the vicious insults slide over me, wrapping them around my resolve. I watched Darnell pacing nervously, checking his phone every few seconds. His debts were catching up to him, and he looked like a man standing on the edge of a steep cliff. Keisha was aggressively chewing her gum, her eyes darting between me and the intensive care unit doors. I could smell the cheap perfume she wore, masking the scent of cigarettes and desperation. They were a family of vultures waiting for a carcass to feed upon, and they were furious that the meal had been delayed. I knew that contradicting Celeste would only escalate the situation and draw unwanted attention to myself. I needed them complacent. I needed them arrogant. Arrogance breeds carelessness, and right now their carelessness was my greatest weapon. I let a single tear slip down my cheek, wiping it away with a trembling hand. "I am so sorry, Celeste," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound fragile and broken. "I just want Roland to be okay." Celeste scoffed loudly, turning her back to me in absolute disgust. She gathered Darnell and Keisha, pulling them into a tight circle to whisper furiously about calling their private physicians. I remained in my chair, watching their backs, letting them revel in their false sense of superiority. They honestly believed they were breaking me down. They had no idea they were simply laying the groundwork for their own spectacular destruction. I breathed the sterile hospital air, centering my focus. The poison had been meant for me, and now the patriarch of their precious family was fighting for his life on a ventilator just down the hall. The irony was exquisite, but I could not afford to dwell on it. I had to anticipate Tavon's next move. He had tried to kill me this morning. When murder fails, greedy men always resort to theft. A firm hand gripped my shoulder, pulling me from my thoughts. Tavon stood over me, his face a masterpiece of fabricated agony. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he had managed to produce genuine-looking sweat on his forehead. He gently guided me up from the vinyl chair and led me away from the glaring eyes of his mother. We walked down a quiet corridor until we reached a secluded private family alcove tucked away near the chapel. The dim lighting cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the desperate act he was about to put on. "Simone, baby," he murmured, pulling me into a tight embrace. I let my body go completely limp against him, playing the role of the exhausted, devastated wife. "I cannot believe this is happening," he whispered into my hair, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "My dad is fighting for his life in there, and I am so worried about you. You look completely drained. The stress of the business is already too much for you, and now this terrible tragedy." I pulled back slightly, looking up into the eyes of the man who had poured concentrated lethal toxin into my breakfast just hours ago. "I tried to eat your food, Tavon," I thought coldly. "I wonder how drained I would look if your plan had succeeded." Outwardly, I gave a weak nod, letting my shoulders slump. "I am just so scared," I replied, keeping my tone soft and utterly dependent. He seized the opening instantly, stroking my arms with a practiced soothing rhythm. "Listen to me," he said smoothly, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You need to rest. You need to focus entirely on your mental health and on supporting the family right now. You cannot carry the weight of a massive real estate empire while we are dealing with this trauma. Let me take the burden off your shoulders just temporarily." I recognized the play immediately. It was so predictable it was almost insulting. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a neatly folded stack of legal documents. The paper was thick, expensive stock bearing the watermarked logo of his father's preferred law firm. I could see the tiny, colorful flags, indicating exactly where I needed to sign away my entire life's work, my sweat, my blood, my tears. "I had my attorney draft a temporary power of attorney over your firm," he explained, pressing the papers gently into my hands. It just gives me the authority to handle the day-to-day operations, sign off on the minor contracts, and keep the board of directors off your back. You will not have to worry about a single corporate decision until my father recovers. I stared at the documents, my mind analyzing the trap. He wanted control of my assets. Because his murder attempt had failed, he was pivoting to a hostile financial takeover. He needed my money desperately enough to kill for it, and now he was trying to steal it with a pen. I looked up at him, forcing another tear to well in my eyes and spill over my lashes. "You would do that for me?" I asked, my voice trembling with manufactured gratitude. "I would do anything for you, Simone." He lied flawlessly, pulling me back against his chest. I promised to sign the papers the very next day, telling him I needed a good night's sleep before looking at legal forms. I felt him exhale a deep breath of relief against my shoulder. He truly believed his secondary plan was working perfectly. He thought I was a naive, grieving woman handing over the keys to my kingdom. He had no idea he was stepping directly into a financial bear trap. I told Tavon I needed to step outside to get some fresh air and make a few phone calls to my executive team. He kissed my forehead and hurried back to the intensive care unit waiting room, eager to update his mother on his perceived victory. I walked purposefully through the sliding glass doors of the main entrance, letting the cool afternoon air clear the suffocating hospital smell from my lungs. I did not stop at this courtyard. I bypassed the taxi stand and walked directly toward the subterranean parking garage. The concrete walls echoed with the sound of my heels as I descended into the lower levels. Far in the darkest corner of the third sublevel, a heavily tinted armored SUV sat idling silently. I approached the rear passenger side and the heavy door unlocked with a quiet click. I climbed inside, sliding onto the plush leather seat and firmly pulling the door shut, blocking out the rest of the world. The interior was bathed in the soft blue light of a mounted laptop screen. The leather smelled rich and untouched, a stark contrast to the sterile sickness of the hospital above us. Vance wore a charcoal suit that cost more than a luxury car, his eyes calculating and sharp, missing absolutely nothing in the confined space. Behind it sat Vance, my brilliant, absolutely ruthless, Harvard-educated attorney and personal fixer. Vance did not do family law. He did corporate warfare and crisis obliteration. We did not exchange pleasantries. There was no time for small talk. I reached into my slacks and pulled out the folded cloth napkin and the metal spoon, setting them carefully on the center console. "Test this," I commanded, keeping my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. Vance did not ask questions. He produced a specialized mobile chemical testing kit from a metallic briefcase on the floor. He carefully swabbed the residue from the spoon and the napkin, inserting the samples into a small digital centrifuge device. The vehicle was entirely silent except for the low hum of the engine and the quiet whir of the testing equipment. I watched the progress bar on his screen, my heart pounding with a steady, icy rhythm. A minute later, the machine chimed. The results flashed across the screen in stark red lettering. Vance adjusted his glasses, his normally stoic face registering a flicker of genuine shock. "This is highly concentrated macadamia extract," he stated, his voice gravely and precise. "The dosage on this spoon alone was meant to stop a human heart within 5 minutes. Given your specific allergy, Simone, your throat would have closed completely before you even hit the floor. It was a guaranteed kill shot." Hearing the clinical confirmation of my husband's intent solidified the frozen rage sitting in my chest. He had not just wanted me sick, he had wanted me dead instantly, and without any possibility of resuscitation. I leaned back against the leather seat, processing the magnitude of the betrayal I survived by seconds. "Vance," I murmured, staring at the red letters on the screen. "He wants my company. He just handed me a temporary power of attorney to sign." Vance closed the testing kit with a sharp snap and reached for a thick manila folder resting on the passenger seat. He turned to me, his expression darker and more serious than I had ever seen it. "The poison is not the worst part, Simone," he said, sliding the heavy folder onto my lap. "Look at what your husband signed 30 days ago." I opened the heavy folder, my fingers brushing against the crisp legal paper inside. The first document was a sprawling contract bearing a seal I did not recognize. Vance leaned forward and tapped the top corner of the page. "That is a $15 million life insurance policy," he stated. "Tavon initiated the underwriting exactly 30 days ago." I stared at the sum, the string of zeros blurring together. $15 million. My husband had calculated the exact value of my life down to the last cent. Vance flipped to the next page, revealing a complex web of financial routing. He did not use our usual brokers. Vance continued. He went through a shadow firm operating out of a shell corporation in Panama. He wanted this completely off the grid, entirely untraceable to anyone looking at your standard domestic accounts. He paid the exorbitant premiums in cash pulling from a hidden reserve we just uncovered. I scanned the beneficiary line. The money was not slated to go into our joint accounts. It was directed to a secure offshore trust. I read the names attached to the trust, and a fresh wave of nausea hit me. Tavin was the primary beneficiary, but right beneath his name, holding secondary access and full executive control in the event of Tavin's absence, was Judge Rowland. My breath hitched in my throat. The entire family was in on the hit. This was not the desperate act of a solitary man. This was a calculated, unified conspiracy organized by a retired federal judge and executed by my own husband. They sat at my dining table, smiled at my face, and coordinated my assassination. The judge had used his extensive legal knowledge to ensure the offshore trust was completely bulletproof, shielded from any domestic tax audits or legal inquiries. If I had consumed those poisoned grits, the autopsy would have shown an accidental allergic reaction. The coroner would rule it anaphylaxis. My vast real estate empire would fall into disarray, and while the board of directors scrambled to find a successor, Tavon and his father would quietly collect $15 million in untraceable cash. They would mourn me publicly wearing custom black suits paid for by my death. Vance pointed to another signature at the bottom of the trust agreement. Celeste signed as a witness. He said quietly, "She knew. Keisha and Darnell knew. They were all waiting for the payout. They looked at you and saw nothing but a massive payday." I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer scale of their betrayal. Every insult from Celeste, every arrogant lecture from the judge, it was all a distraction. They were vultures, circling a target they believed was already dead. The $15 million was their ultimate prize. A massive influx of untraceable wealth designed to elevate their prestigious lineage to an untouchable status. But greed is a sloppy motivator. I opened my eyes and looked at Vance, the initial shock completely evaporating. "Why did he need the $15 million right now?" I asked. "Tavon likes money, but he is lazy. Orchestrating a murder requires a desperate kind of motivation. What is driving this extreme urgency?" Vance turned the page. "The motive sharpens here," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "We pulled the curtain back on Tavon's sports consulting firm. You always thought it was just a vanity project to keep him occupied. It is actually a highly sophisticated front for a crippling gambling addiction." I stared at the ledgers Vance placed in my lap, rows of red numbers stretched across the pages, detailing his losses. Tavon had been hemorrhaging money for years, betting on illegal offshore sportsbooks, high-stakes underground poker games, and volatile cryptocurrency margins. His losses were astronomical. "He owes $5 million, Vance explained, pointing to a highlighted section. "And he does not owe it to a bank. He owes it to a violent shadow syndicate operating right here in the city. The debt has been routed directly through Darnell's downtown nightclubs. Darnell is not just a struggling club owner. He is the regional bagman for this syndicate." The pieces slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Darnell was always visiting our home at odd hours, always pulling Tavon into hushed, aggressive conversations in the study. I had assumed Darnell was simply asking for handouts. In reality, he was collecting. "Darnell has been threatening to expose the massive debt," Vance continued. "If the syndicate goes public, or if they resort to violence to collect, the family's pristine political and social standing would be instantly ruined. Judge Rowland's legacy would be dragged through the mud. A scandal of this magnitude would strip them of their country club memberships, their political influence, and their carefully cultivated aristocratic image. They could not allow that to happen. Killing me was their collective way out. The $15 million insurance payout would easily cover the $5 million syndicate debt, leaving $10 million to divide among themselves. I felt a cold, bitter laugh rise in my chest. My life was simply a math equation to them. Subtract Simone, clear the syndicate debt, and protect the family name. Darnell was holding a loaded gun to his head, demanding his money, and my husband decided to sacrifice me to save himself. The sheer cowardice of his plan disgusted me more than the poison itself. He lacked the spine to face his own failures, so he chose to murder the woman who provided the very roof over his head. I traced my finger over the red numbers, committing the syndicate's details to memory. Tavon was trapped in a cage of his own making, and the walls were closing in quickly. The syndicate does not care about his last name or his father's judicial robes. They only care about their $5 million. The urgency was palpable. Tavon was out of time, which explained the sloppy, desperate attempt with the macadamia extract this morning. He needed me dead before the end of the month. I looked at Vance. Is there anything else I need to know? Vance flipped to the very last page of the dossier. The final piece of the puzzle, he murmured, sliding a stack of glossy surveillance photos across the leather console. I picked up the photographs, my eyes scanning the images. They showed Tavon carrying luxury shopping bags and designer baby items into a gleaming high-rise building. Surveillance photos of Tavon moving a young woman into a luxury penthouse in Arlington, Vance stated clinically. Her name is Sasha. She is a former bottle service waitress from one of Darnell's clubs. I stared at a close-up photo of Sasha. She was standing on the balcony of the penthouse wearing a silk maternity dress. Her hands were resting protectively on a heavily pregnant belly. She is 6 months pregnant, Vance confirmed, anticipating my unspoken question. And it is a boy. My breath stopped. A boy. Tavon and I had spent the last 4 years quietly struggling with fertility issues. The countless doctor appointments, the invasive treatments, the silent heartbreak, every single time a test came back negative. And all the while, my husband was spending his nights in Darnell's clubs, betting a waitress who was now carrying his child. He moved her into that penthouse 3 weeks ago, Vance continued. The lease is signed under a dummy corporation, but the funds trace back to an account Tavon manages. He has been outfitting the nursery with custom-imported furniture. He is preparing for a new life. The master plan was fully illuminated. The gambling debt was the urgent catalyst, but the baby was the ultimate prize. Tavon planned to use my real estate empire and my life insurance payout to raise his new heir. He wanted to eradicate me, clear his slate, and build a new family, using the fortune I built with my own 2 hands. They would sit in my mansion raising his illegitimate son, while I rotted in this ground. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was staggering. They believed they deserved everything I had simply because of their last name. I did not shed a single tear. The sadness had completely burned away, leaving nothing but an arctic, absolute rage. I stared at the photograph of Sasha rubbing her pregnant belly, absorbing every detail of her joyful smile. They want my empire to fund their bloodline, I whispered, my voice turning to solid ice. They want to use my corpse as a stepping stone to their perfect future. I stacked the photographs, the financial ledgers, and the insurance policy back into the folder. I handed the dossier back to Vance. The shock was gone. In its place was a sharp, predatory focus. I knew exactly what needed to be done. Vance, I said, looking him dead in the eyes. Prepare the final ghost protocol. Let them think they have won. Let them celebrate their victory. We are going to burn their entire world to the ground. By the time the doctors placed Judge Rowland on life support later that evening, the family had already set their invasion into motion. They used their manufactured grief as the ultimate weapon, wrapping themselves in a cloak of sorrow to justify their immediate occupation of my home. My 12,000-square-foot mansion in Potomac became their personal spoils of war. Celeste was the first to arrive. She did not even bother to knock, simply marching through the grand double doors with 3 matching leather suitcases trailing behind her, carried by a hired driver. She loudly proclaimed that she could not possibly bear the oppressive silence of her own empty house, while her beloved husband lay clinging to life in a sterile hospital bed, within hours. Darnell and Keisha followed suit. They claimed they needed to be close to the family core during this trying time to offer emotional support. In reality, they were staking their claim on the territory they believed would soon be theirs permanently. The sheer audacity of their behavior was breathtaking to witness. They did not treat my home as a place of mourning. They treated it as a conquered palace. By the second morning of their occupation, Keisha had completely bypassed any pretense of boundary. I stood quietly at the top of the grand staircase, gripping the mahogany railing, and watched her rummage through the crystal bowl on the entryway console. She retrieved the spare set of keys to my midnight blue Porsche Panamera. She tossed them into the air, caught them with a greedy laugh, and shouted to Darnell that she was going for a spin to clear her head. I listened to the roar of my twin-turbo engine echoing down the circular driveway, my expression perfectly blank. Meanwhile, Celeste wasted absolutely no time marking her territory. She commandeered the entire East Guest Wing, an area larger than most single-family homes. Before the end of the week, I watched a parade of interior decorators and high-end contractors file through my front doors. Celeste was actively directing them, pointing a manicured finger at my custom silk draperies and demanding they be ripped down and replaced with something more suitable to her aristocratic tastes. She ordered the imported Italian marble side tables to be removed because they felt too modern, instructing the designers to source antique mahogany pieces on my family accounts. She swept through the corridors like a ruling monarch, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about the lack of proper domestic staff, oblivious to the fact that I had intentionally dismissed the staff with full pay to minimize witnesses. They swarmed the property, consuming the space, the food, and the resources with a ravenous hunger. I watched them pour expensive wines at lunch and leave half-eaten plates of gourmet food on the antique tables, treating the estate with the careless disrespect of vandals. Every insult, every stolen item, and every arrogant command fueled the fire burning quietly inside my chest. To sell the illusion of my total defeat, I transformed myself into a ghost, haunting my own home. I acted heavily medicated, cultivating an aura of absolute emotional devastation. I swapped my tailored business suits for loose-flowing silk robes that made me look fragile and small. I stopped wearing makeup, let my hair fall naturally, and perfected a vacant, hollow stare. Whenever Tavon or his family members entered a room, I would shrink into the corners, wrapping my arms around myself and strictly avoiding eye contact. I shuffled through the sprawling corridors with a slow, deliberate lethargy, playing the part of a wife entirely broken by the sudden tragedy befalling her father-in-law and the overwhelming pressure of her life. Tavon ate it up completely. His ego, already inflated by his perceived successful poisoning of his father, swelled to monumental proportions. He approached me in the solarium on the third day, holding a silver pen and the temporary power of attorney documents we had discussed at the hospital. He crouched beside my chair, putting on a mask of deep, agonizing concern. He whispered that the board members of my real estate firm were demanding answers and that I was in no condition to face them. He promised he would handle the burdensome corporate trivialities so I could rest my mind. I let my hands shake visibly as I took the pen. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing a single tear to track down my cheek, and blindly signed my name across the dotted lines. I handed him temporary control of my entire commercial real estate empire. The moment the ink dried, Tavon stopped pretending. The mask of the concerned husband dissolved instantly, replaced by the smug, arrogant sneer of a man who believed he held the world in his palm. He snatched the documents, kissed the top of my head dismissively, and practically sprinted down the hall. With the legal authority firmly in his grasp, Tavon immediately began utilizing my private study as his personal headquarters. The study is a sacred space lined with floor-to-ceiling cherrywood bookshelves housing first-edition architectural texts and my most sensitive private files. Tavon invaded it with Darnell and a rotating cast of shady associates from the nightclub underworld. They tracked mud onto the Persian rugs and filled the room with the thick, suffocating stench of cheap cigars. From the hallway, I could hear their booming laughter and the clinking of heavy crystal glasses. Tevon was generously pouring drinks from my private reserve, cracking open bottles of Macallan 25-year-old single malt scotch that cost thousands of dollars each. He was hosting his criminal cronies in the very heart of my sanctuary, treating my hard-earned assets as his personal slush fund. He strutted around the study, shouting orders into his phone, loudly bragging about his new executive status, completely unaware that he was sealing his own doom. What Tevon, Celeste, Keisha, and Darnell did not know was that my mansion was no longer just a home. It was a fully operational surveillance trap. Hours before they had initiated their opportunistic invasion, I had Vance dispatch a team of elite specialized security contractors to the property, under the guise of routine HVAC maintenance. They had systematically wired the entire 12,000 square feet. They installed military-grade microscopic audio and video bugs in every single room, hallway, and gathering space. The devices were completely undetectable, embedded inside light fixtures, hidden within the ornate crown molding, and slipped behind the covers of the air vents. The heaviest concentration of surveillance was focused directly inside my private study. While my parasitic in-laws paraded around the house believing they had conquered me, I retreated to my massive walk-in closet. Hidden behind a row of winter coats was a biometric safe. Inside the safe rested a heavily encrypted secure tablet linked directly to the surveillance network. I sat on the plush velvet ottoman in the center of the closet, wrapped in my silk robe, staring at the glowing screen. The high-definition video feeds were crystal clear, and the audio was flawless. I tapped the screen, bringing the camera feed from the study to the forefront. Tevon and Darnell were lounging in my custom leather wingback chairs, their feet propped carelessly on my antique desk. A cloud of cigar smoke hung heavy in the air. Darnell took a long sip of my expensive scotch and laughed a cruel, guttural sound. He slapped his knee and openly mocked my performance. He told Tevon he could not believe how easy it was to break me, calling me a weak, overly emotional fool who folded at the first sign of real pressure. Tevon smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He boasted that I was so heavily medicated I did not even know what day it was, let alone what documents I was signing. Then the conversation took a dark, horrifying turn that validated every single countermeasure I had put in place. Darnell leaned forward, his face turning entirely serious. He asked Tevon about the timeline for the life insurance payout. Tevon took a drag from his cigar and casually mentioned that the $15 million would clear within weeks, but only upon a confirmed death. With chilling indifference, my husband outlined his plan to pull the plug on Judge Rowland. He explained that his father was a loose end, a complication that was tying up the funds they desperately needed. They agreed they would wait a few more days to maintain appearances, then convinced Celeste to terminate life support, effectively murdering the patriarch to accelerate the cash flow. The sheer depravity of their patricide hung heavy in the room. Darnell slammed his glass on the desk, demanding his $5 million syndicate payment by the end of the month, warning Tevon that the men in Baltimore were losing patience. Tevon chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. He guaranteed the money, leaning back and boasting that he now held total control over my corporate accounts. He bragged that he could wire the $5 million with a single phone call on Monday morning. Sitting alone in the quiet dark of my closet, I did not cry. I simply stared at the tablet, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. Tevon thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he held the keys to my kingdom, but the accounts he was so confidently boasting about, the ones he believed he controlled, were already entirely compromised. While my house was being overrun by parasites, I was moving like a shadow across the eastern seaboard. I waited until the mansion was completely silent, the only sound the distant hum of the security system and the muffled snores of Darnell echoing from the guest wing. At 2 a.m, I slipped out through the subterranean garage, stepping into the waiting armored SUV. Vance was already inside, tapping away on his tablet. The drive to Dulles International Airport was swift and silent. A private charter jet was waiting on the tarmac, its engines already purring. We were airborne within 20 minutes, piercing the thick night sky, headed straight for Delaware. Delaware is the corporate haven of America, a place where companies can be created, dissolved, and restructured with a level of opacity that borders on the criminal. I had established my primary holding company there over a decade ago, taking advantage of their notoriously tight privacy laws. But tonight I was not there to build. I was there to dismantle. We landed in Wilmington just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. I bypassed the standard executive suites and headed straight for a nondescript, heavily guarded office building in the financial district. Waiting inside was a team of elite forensic accountants and offshore legal specialists Vance had assembled. They were the best in the world, men and women who specialized in making vast sums of money completely disappear. For years, I had maintained a highly complex corporate restructuring plan. Originally, it was designed as a drastic, absolute last resort for tax purposes, a way to shield my assets in the event of a catastrophic market crash or a hostile corporate takeover. I had never intended to use it against my own husband, but the weapon was fully loaded and waiting. I sat at the head of a massive conference table surrounded by lawyers and accountants and gave the order to execute. Over the next 6 hours, we initiated a flurry of rapid-fire wire transfers, corporate resolutions, and asset reallocations. The restructuring was a masterpiece of financial aggression. My primary company, the one Tavon now legally controlled through his temporary power of attorney, was a behemoth. It held over $100 million in liquid capital, dozens of high-yield commercial real estate contracts, and a massive portfolio of intellectual property related to urban development designs. I systematically stripped every single valuable asset out of that company. The liquid cash was drained first, funneled through a dizzying maze of shell corporations, before resting safely in an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust established in the Cayman Islands. A trust so completely divorced from my name that even the federal government would struggle to trace it. Next went the real estate contracts, the lucrative development deals in downtown D.C., the luxury high-rises in Arlington, the sprawling commercial complexes in Maryland. Every single deed, title, and holding was legally transferred to newly minted anonymous LLCs under the umbrella of the Cayman Trust. I was amputating the healthy beating heart of my empire and leaving behind a hollow, rotting shell. I signed document after document, my wrist cramping from the sheer volume of paperwork, but I did not stop. I was methodical, ensuring that not a single penny or viable asset remained in the original corporate entity. By noon, the primary company was completely devoid of value. It was nothing more than a name on a piece of paper, a ghost ship sailing toward a financial abyss. Taven believed he had just inherited an empire, but he was holding the keys to an empty, desolate kingdom. He was the temporary CEO of nothing. But leaving the company empty was not enough. I needed to ensure that his greed became his absolute undoing. I needed to build a trap so devastating that he would never be able to claw his way out. That is where the poison pill came into play. Over the past 5 years, my firm had occasionally acquired highly leveraged toxic commercial debt as part of larger portfolio buyouts. These were failing strip malls, abandoned industrial parks, and heavily mortgaged developments that were hemorrhaging money. I had kept these toxic assets carefully quarantined in a separate, heavily insulated holding company, slowly liquidating them to minimize the financial impact. Now, I weaponized them. I directed the accounting team to initiate a massive unilateral transfer. We moved exactly $40 million of this toxic, highly leveraged commercial debt directly into the hollow shell of my primary company. It was a massive influx of pure financial poison. The shell company, now completely devoid of any cash or assets to service those loans, was instantly pushed into catastrophic insolvency. The brilliance of the trap lay in the specific wording of the temporary power of attorney Tavon had so eagerly presented to me at the hospital. In his haste to seize control, he had used a standard boilerplate legal template provided by his father's firm. He had failed to include the necessary indemnification clauses. By signing that document and executing the new executive addendums he had drafted to impress Darnell Tavon, had unknowingly crossed a fatal legal threshold. He had moved past simple corporate oversight and assumed total unavoidable personal liability for the company's financial state. He was now personally, legally responsible for $40 million in toxic debt. If the creditors came knocking, they would not be looking at an empty shell company. They would be looking directly at Tavon. The trap was set, the jaws primed to snap shut the moment he made a move. We left the Delaware office building and headed straight back to the tarmac. The sun was high overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete. I stood by the stairs of my private jet, the wind whipping my hair around my face. Vance approached carrying a thick leather binder containing the finalized notarized paperwork of the entire restructuring. He stopped in front of me, his expression a mix of professional awe and grim satisfaction. He opened the binder, pointing to the final page bearing the official state seals. "He is legally bound to the debt," Simone Vance said, his voice steady over the roar of the jet engines. "He is holding a $40 million grenade with the pin pulled. The moment he tries to liquidate any of the assets he thinks he controls to pay off Darnell's syndicate, the federal auditors will immediately flag the transaction if he tries to move a single dollar out of that hollow shell. The feds will arrest him for corporate fraud and massive embezzlement." I looked at the paperwork, tracing the raised seal with my fingertip. The rage that had been burning inside me was now a cold, focused flame. I had dismantled my own empire to build his electric chair. I closed the binder and handed it back to Vance. I turned and began walking up the stairs of the jet, ready to return to the mansion and resume my performance as the broken, grieving wife. "Let him play CEO for a few more days," I said, not looking back. "Let him believe he is a king before we show him the guillotine." The plan was flawless on paper, but paperwork alone does not sever the kind of violent, entrenched ties Tavon had forged with the Baltimore syndicate. While he was trapped holding the bag for $40 million in toxic commercial debt, the immediate physical threat was Darnell. Darnell was the muscle, the heavy-handed enforcer squeezing Tavon for the $5 million owed to the syndicate. He was the rabid dog snapping at my husband's heels, driving the frantic urgency that had nearly ended my life with macadamia extract. But Darnell was just a mid-level operator. He was the collector, not the creditor. I needed to cut the leash holding the dog. I needed to own the leash entirely. Vance initiated the contact through an impenetrable web of encrypted offshore servers. He bypassed Darnell, completely reaching out directly to the syndicate bosses operating out of the Baltimore docks. These were men who dealt in shadows, who moved millions in illicit funds through seemingly legitimate shipping logistics. They did not respond to threats. And they certainly did not respond to police involvement. They responded to one thing: overwhelming, unassailable financial leverage. I arranged a clandestine meeting for 2 a.m. at a heavily guarded, decommissioned shipyard overlooking the Patapsco River. I arrived in a sleek, unmarked black sedan. I stepped out onto the damp concrete, the harsh sodium lights reflecting off the oily black water of the harbor. Two massive men in heavy overcoats patted Vance down before waving us into a cavernous, dimly lit warehouse. The air smelled of rust and stale salt water. At the center of the vast space sat a folding table illuminated by a single harsh, hanging bulb. Three men sat on the opposite side. The man in the center, the undisputed shot caller, was older, his face a map of deep lines and calculated stillness. He did not offer his hand or introduce himself. He simply leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and waited for me to speak. I did not waste time with pleasantries or posturing. I sat down directly across from him, placed my hands flat on the table, and laid out my proposition with surgical precision. I explained that I was intimately aware of the $5 million marker held against Tavon Rowland, currently being serviced through their regional enforcer Darnell. I stated clearly that the current collection strategy was sloppy, highly volatile, and dangerously close to attracting federal scrutiny due to the sheer incompetence of the debtor. I did not mention my relationship to Tavon. To them, I was simply an anonymous, heavily capitalized buyer looking to acquire high-risk debt. The boss remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on me. "We do not sell our paper." He rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "We collect." I did not blink. I signaled to Vance. He stepped forward and placed a sleek metallic briefcase on the table, opening it to reveal heavily encrypted banking ledgers. "You collect when the debt is serviceable," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register. The current debtor is severely compromised and entirely illiquid. I am offering you an immediate clean exit. I pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. It detailed an instant untraceable wire transfer originating from my Cayman Blind Trust. I was not just offering to clear Tavon's $5 million debt. I was offering a substantial premium, a 20% override in clean laundered cash, in exchange for the total unencumbered acquisition of Darnell's entire regional debt portfolio. I was offering them a massive payday without the hassle of a violent collection. The boss looked at the numbers, his expression betraying a flicker of genuine surprise. He consulted quietly with the men flanking him. They were seasoned criminals completely desensitized to violence, but they were also businessmen. They understood the sheer value of the cash I was sliding across the table. It was clean money, expertly layered and instantly accessible, bypassing their usual laundering networks. "You want the paper on the roll-in, kid?" the boss finally said, looking back at me. "And you want Darnell's collection rights?" "I want the leash," I confirmed, holding his gaze without a hint of hesitation. The boss studied me for a long moment, evaluating the cold, clinical efficiency of my offer. He recognized a predator when he saw one. He nodded slowly, a tight, grim smile forming on his lips. He reached into his coat and produced a thick stack of heavily redacted contracts and collateral agreements. He signed his name at the bottom of the transfer addendums and slid the entire stack across the table. The transaction was complete. With a single signature and a massive wire transfer, I had effectively bought the violent underworld syndicate that was threatening my husband. We left the warehouse and drove back to D.C. in silence. I sat in the back of the SUV, flipping through the stack of documents I had just acquired. I was no longer just the victim of a coordinated assassination attempt. I was now the invisible puppet master controlling the very forces my in-laws feared most. I technically owned every single cent of Tavon's astronomical gambling debt, but the real prize was buried deep within the collateral agreements. To secure the loans and maintain his status as the regional bagman, Darnell had put up his own assets as collateral. I now held the official uncontestable deeds to all four of Darnell's downtown nightclubs. Those clubs were Darnell's entire identity. They were his source of income, his base of operations, and the foundation of his inflated ego. He strutted through them like a king, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had just been sold out from under him. I owned the walls, the liquor licenses, and the very air he breathed inside those buildings. The following evening, I was back in the mansion, continuing my performance as the heavily medicated grieving wife. The parasitic occupation was in full swing. Celeste was loudly complaining about the lack of imported truffles, while Keisha lounged on my velvet sofa, aggressively scrolling through her phone. Darnell and Tavon were seated at my massive dining table, tearing into plates of catered steak and laughing uproariously about some crude joke. I sat at the far end of the table, pushing a piece of asparagus around my plate, my eyes downcast, cultivating an aura of absolute misery. Underneath the table, I held a secure, untraceable burner phone Vance had procured for me. I typed a single, heavily encrypted text message and sent it directly to Darnell's private line. I watched the exact moment the message arrived. Darnell's phone buzzed sharply against the mahogany table. He picked it up, a greasy smile still lingering on his face from his previous joke. He glanced at the screen. The smile vanished instantly, wiped away as if by a physical blow. His face drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly gray. The text was simple, direct, and completely anonymous. "Your debt portfolio has been sold. The new creditor requires payment in full in 7 days or the clubs burn." Darnell stared at the screen, his chest heaving. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead, tracking slowly down his temple. He looked up, his eyes wide and frantic, scanning the room as if searching for a sniper. He looked at Tavon, who was still laughing, completely oblivious to the sudden terror gripping his brother-in-law. Darnell swallowed hard, his hands shaking so violently he had to put the phone face down on the table. He was a man who traded in fear, and he had just realized that a much larger, entirely unknown predator had just locked its jaws around his throat. I took a small sip of my water, masking the cold, triumphant smile that threatened to break my carefully constructed facade. The panic was beautiful to witness, too. The countdown had officially begun. Darnell was a problem, temporarily contained a rat trapped in a cage of his own making, desperately scrambling for $5 million he could never produce. But Taven had more than one vulnerability. His most glaring weakness was the very reason he needed my money in the first place, Sasha. The 6 months pregnant bottle service waitress living in the luxury Arlington penthouse financed entirely by my stolen wealth. It was time to introduce a little chaos into their perfect imported nursery. I did not want to destroy Sasha physically. She was merely a symptom of Tavon's profound inadequacy. I wanted to destroy her illusion of security. I wanted to turn her from a willing accomplice into a paranoid liability. I operated from the solarium of my mansion, a silk robe draped over my shoulders, projecting the image of a grieving, heavily medicated widow to any of the parasitic in-laws who happened to wander past. In reality, I was orchestrating a psychological strike. I had Vance's team assemble an unmarked matte black box. The presentation was deliberately stark and intimidating. Inside the box, I placed a carefully curated collection of documents designed to trigger a specific primal fear abandonment. The centerpiece was a set of offshore bank statements. They were heavily doctored by my team in Delaware, but visually flawless and terrifyingly convincing. The statements showed Tavon's personal hidden accounts, the ones he bragged about to Darnell, being aggressively liquidated. The documents detailed massive, unilateral transfers moving millions of dollars into untouchable accounts in the United Arab Emirates. Directly beneath these statements was a printout of an electronic flight confirmation. It showed a one-way first-class ticket booked on Emirates Airlines from Washington Dulles to Dubai, scheduled for departure in exactly 10 days. The ticket was issued for a single passenger, Tavon Rowland. The narrative the box told was undeniable. It screamed that Tavon was quietly gathering his resources, preparing to cut his losses, and planning to vanish across the globe, leaving his pregnant mistress behind to deal with the fallout. I watched the live feed from the hidden camera Vance had installed in the hallway outside Sasha's penthouse. A bonded courier stepped off the elevator, placed the black box on the welcome mat, knocked sharply twice, and disappeared before the door even opened. A moment later, Sasha appeared. She was wearing a plush robe, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She looked confused, picking up the box and retreating back inside. I imagined her opening it, the cold reality of the documents sinking into her mind. The seed was planted. It just needed a little water to grow. To ensure the seed of doubt blossomed into full-blown paranoia, the black box contained a second layer of evidence. Beneath the flight confirmation lay a stack of high-resolution surveillance photographs. They were not doctored. They were entirely real, taken by the private investigators I had hired months ago when I first suspected Tavon's infidelity. The photos showed Tavon inside various high-end jewelers in Georgetown and Chevy Chase. He was leaning over glass counters examining diamond tennis necklaces, platinum bracelets, and extravagant emerald earrings. The trap was in the context. Sasha had never received any of these pieces. She had received a leased penthouse and custom cribs, but the diamonds were never for her. Tavon had purchased those pieces for me. He had used my own money to buy me extravagant apologies for his late nights and unexplained absences, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of the devoted, loving husband while he plotted my murder. For a woman sitting in a penthouse, she didn't own pregnant by a married man who owed millions to a violent syndicate. Those photos were devastating. They proved that Tavon was a pathological liar who operated a double life with effortless ease. If he could lie so flawlessly to the wife he was planning to murder, what was he lying to her about? The narrative solidified in her mind. The baby was just a prop. The penthouse was a temporary holding cell, and the jewelry proved his loyalties were entirely fluid. I checked the vitals monitor Vance had managed to sync with her smartwatch, a little technological overreach that I found endlessly amusing. Her heart rate was spiking. I could almost picture her pacing the imported hardwood floors of the penthouse, hormonal isolated and increasingly terrified. She was realizing the precarious nature of her position. If Tavon boarded that flight to Dubai, she would be left holding the bag. The dummy corporation holding the lease would evaporate. The syndicate would come looking for assets to seize, and she would be a single mother with a target on her back. The panic I had engineered was taking root, twisting her affection into desperate self-preservation. Sasha did not wait for Taiwan to come to her. The panic demanded immediate action. 3 hours after the black box was delivered, the tracker on her phone showed her moving rapidly toward downtown DC. She was heading straight for Tavon's office, a rented executive suite he maintained to legitimize his fake sports consulting firm. It was a sterile, glass-walled room he used almost exclusively to nap and watch game tape away from my watchful eye. I pulled up the security feed for the building on my encrypted tablet. Vance had bypassed their archaic firewall days ago. I watched Sasha storm through the lobby, bypassing the receptionist and marching directly to the elevators. She looked unhinged, her hair messy, clutching the black box tightly against her chest. I switched the camera feed to the hallway outside Tavon's suite. She didn't bother knocking. She threw the heavy glass door open and marched inside. The audio feed from the suite's intercom system crackled to life. Sasha slammed the black box onto Tavon's desk, scattering his papers. "What the hell is this, Tavon?" Her voice was shrill, echoing off the glass walls. "A one-way ticket to Dubai. You're liquidating the accounts." Tavon, clearly startled from a nap, scrambled upright, trying to maintain a facade of calm authority. "Sasha, calm down. Where did you get that? It's fake. It's a misunderstanding." "Don't lie to me," she screamed, her voice cracking. She threw the photos of the jewelry at him. "You bought her diamonds while you stuck me in that apartment. You're leaving me here. You're going to let Darnell's people tear me apart while you sit in a luxury suite in the Emirates." Tavon's eyes widened in genuine panic. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing nervously at the glass door. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Sasha fired back, leaning over the desk, her face inches from his. The fear had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate, cornered aggression. "I know about the 5 million you owe. I know Darnell is ready to kill you for it. And I know about the poison Tavon. I know what you're doing to Simone." Tavon froze, his face draining of blood. The sudden realization that his mistress held the keys to his complete destruction paralyzed him. "You are going to wire $2 million into my personal account by the end of the week," Sasha demanded, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Untraceable offshore, or I swear to God, Tavon, I will walk straight into the federal building and tell them everything. I'll tell them about the syndicate, the debt, and the macadamia extract. I will burn you to the ground." The silence in the office was deafening. Tavon stared at the woman he thought he controlled, realizing she had just clamped a vice around his neck. The pressure was mounting from every side. Darnell was demanding 5 million, Sasha was demanding 2, and the only asset he thought he had, my company, was an empty, toxic shell. The stress finally fractured his carefully maintained aristocratic mask. Tavon lunged forward, his face contorted in rage, and shoved Sasha hard against the wall. She gasped, grabbing her pregnant belly, shock registering in her eyes as she witnessed the violent reality of the man she thought she loved. "You'll get your money," Tavon snarled, his voice trembling with barely contained violence. "By the end of the week. But if you ever threaten me again, I'll make sure Darnell's people visit you before I leave." He stormed out of the office, leaving Sasha leaning against the glass, breathing heavily. Sitting in my dark closet, I tapped the screen and saved the entire high-definition video and audio recording to an encrypted drive. Tavon had just handed me definitive proof of his extortion, his violent tendencies, and his confession to the poisoning plot. I smiled, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in my eyes. The rats were no longer just trapped. They were beginning to eat each other. The air in the formal dining room was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and aged burgundy, a stark contrast to the venom I was preparing to serve. Sunday dinners at the mansion had become a grotesque pantomime of family unity since my release from the hospital. The parasitic occupation was fully entrenched. Celeste, draped in my cashmere throw, was currently lecturing my private chef on the precise temperature of her asparagus. Keisha, her feet propped casually on the antique mahogany table, was pouring her third glass of $1,000 Bordeaux I had been saving for an anniversary that would never come. Darnell was holding court at the far end, his voice booming as he recounted some vaguely threatening anecdote from his nightclub empire, entirely unaware that I owned the deed to every building he operated in. And Tavon. Tavon sat to my right, playing the role of the devoted, attentive husband. He offered me the best cuts of meat, touched the small of my back with feigned affection, and maintained an expression of deep, solicitous concern. He was acting, waiting for me to succumb to the cumulative effects of the macadamia extract he believed was still coursing through my system. I let him play his part. I let them all gorge themselves on my wealth. They were pigs at a trough, completely oblivious to the slaughterhouse waiting at the end of the chute. I waited until the dessert course was served, a delicate raspberry souffle that Celeste immediately criticized for being too tart, before making my move. I picked up a heavy crystal water glass and tapped it lightly with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear chime cut through the din of their entitlement. The conversation died away, 5 pairs of greedy eyes turning toward me. I took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of exhaustion and fragility I could muster. I slumped slightly in my chair, letting my shoulders round and my gaze soften. I looked at Taven, offering him a weak, adoring smile. "I have an announcement," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, carefully crafted to sound worn thin by illness. "These past few weeks, this ordeal, it has changed me." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air, allowing them to lean in, hungry for whatever weakness I was about to expose. "I've spent the last decade building an empire," I continued, sweeping my gaze across the table. "I have sacrificed my health, my peace of mind, and my time with the man I love." I reached out and covered Tavon's hand with my own. His skin felt like cold marble, but I held it tight. But lying in that hospital bed, I realized none of it matters. The stress, the pressure, it's killing me, literally. I let out a shaky sigh, perfectly timed, watching the anticipation bloom on Celeste's face. She knew what was coming. She could smell the capitulation. "I cannot do this anymore," I said, my voice dropping an octave, solidifying the illusion of absolute surrender. "I am stepping down. Permanently." The collective intake of breath around the table was almost comical. Keisha stopped mid-chew. Darnell lowered his fork. Celeste's eyes widened, practically gleaming with predatory delight. "Taven," I said, turning to look my husband directly in the eyes, "you have been my rock. You stepped up when I was incapacitated, and you have proven that you have the vision and the strength to lead." I squeezed his hand. "I am transferring total permanent control of the primary holding company and the CEO title to you." The table erupted. The reaction was not just euphoric, it was a vulgar, unvarnished display of naked greed. Celeste was the first out of her chair. She bypassed me completely and threw her arms around Tavon's neck, practically sobbing with joy. "Praise God!" she wailed, her voice thick with genuine emotion, masking a profound, terrifying entitlement. "The natural order is finally restored, the man taking his rightful place at the head of the table. I always knew you were meant for greatness, Tavon. Always." Keisha raised her wine glass, laughing loudly. "About damn time we're moving to the big leagues now, baby." Darnell didn't bother with congratulations. He stood up, walked over to Tavon, and clapped him hard on the shoulder. He leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly rumble intended only for Tavon, but I heard every word. 5 million, little brother," Darnell whispered, his eyes dark and hungry. "By the end of the week, you're the king now. Time to pay the toll." Taven looked at Darnell, a flicker of sheer panic crossing his features before he masked it with a tight, arrogant nod. He believed he had won. He believed the hollow shell of a company he was about to inherit held the millions he needed to pay off the syndicate and silence his paranoid mistress. He turned to me, his eyes shining with a sickening mix of triumph and manufactured adoration. He pulled me out of my chair and kissed me passionately, holding me close. "Thank you, Simone," he whispered against my hair. "You won't regret this. I swear to you, I will take care of everything. I will take care of you." "I know you will, baby," I murmured back, pulling away just enough to look at him. "Which is why we are going to do this right. We are not doing this quietly in some lawyer's office." I turned back to the table, projecting an air of sudden, fragile excitement. "Next Friday is the annual HBCU Alumni Charity Gala at the Kennedy Center. My firm is the primary sponsor. All the major players will be there, the developers, the politicians, the media. I smiled a tight, bright expression. I am going to announce the transition there. On stage, I am going to publicly sign the permanent transfer of power over to Tavan in front of the entire city. I want everyone to know that my husband is the new face of the empire. The audacity of the plan sealed the illusion. A public coronation was exactly the kind of grandiose, ego-stroking spectacle Tavan and his family craved. They were completely blinded by the spotlight I was shining in their eyes, unable to see the trapdoor opening beneath their feet. The next 3 days were a blur of meticulous high-stakes orchestration. I left the mansion early every morning claiming I was tying up loose ends and preparing the transition paperwork. In reality, I was finalizing the architecture of their ruin. I did not involve the Kennedy Center's standard event staff or their in-house security. This event required a level of control they could not provide. I funneled a massive untraceable payment from the Cayman Trust to a private military contracting firm Vance had vetted. I hired 20 elite, heavily armed private security operatives. They were not there to protect the guests. They were there to control the perimeter, to secure the exits, and to ensure that when the trap snapped shut, no one involved in the plot against my life could escape the building. I provided the security chief with high-resolution photos of Tavan, Darnell, Celeste, and Keisha. I gave explicit irrevocable orders regarding their movements on the night of the gala. Simultaneously, I coordinated relentlessly with Vance. We synchronized the digital strike. We established a secure uplink to the Kennedy Center's massive audio-visual system. We bypassed their firewalls and took absolute control of the stage screens and the microphone feeds. When I gave the signal, Vance would override the gala's programming and broadcast the evidence I had meticulously collected. The doctored bank statements, the photos of the jewelry, the financial ruin of my company, all of it was primed and ready to be unleashed on the massive screens overlooking the ballroom. I also finalized the legal trap with the forensic accountants in Delaware. The moment Tavan signed the permanent transfer documents on stage, he would legally, irrevocably bind himself to the $40 million in toxic commercial debt I had secretly moved into the holding company. He would sign his name in front of 1,000 witnesses, cementing his personal liability for a financial apocalypse he knew nothing about. He would become the CEO of his own destruction. On the eve of the gala, the mansion was quiet. The parasitic hum of my in-laws had faded as they retreated to their respective wings, undoubtedly dreaming of the wealth they believed was finally theirs. I stood alone in my cavernous walk-in closet, the only light coming from the vanity mirror. Hanging before me in a garment bag was a midnight blue floor-length silk gown. It was severe, elegant, and entirely unyielding. It was armor. I ran my hand over the cool fabric, feeling the quiet hum of adrenaline building in my veins. I turned away from the dress and walked toward the back of the closet, pushing aside rows of designer coats to reveal a heavy, biometric wall safe hidden behind a false panel. I pressed my thumb to the scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside, resting on a velvet tray, was a simple plastic Ziploc bag. I reached in and pulled it out, holding it up to the light. Inside the bag was the silver stirring spoon I had taken from my bedside table on the night of my collapse. The spoon that still held the microscopic traces of macadamia extract. The physical proof of my husband's attempt to murder me. I stared at the spoon. The silver tarnished the edges clouded by the dried residue of the poison. It was a crude, brutal weapon wielded by a coward who lacked the spine to look me in the eye when he tried to end my life. I traced the outline of the spoon through the plastic. The fear and confusion that had choked me in that hospital bed were completely gone, replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. I had dismantled my empire, bought a violent underworld syndicate, and engineered a public spectacle of unparalleled devastation. I had built a guillotine, and tomorrow night I was going to drop the blade. I carefully placed the bag back into the safe and locked the heavy door. I turned back to the midnight blue gown, my reflection catching in the mirror. My eyes were dark, unreadable, and completely devoid of mercy. Tomorrow the performance ended. Tomorrow the execution begins. The evening air was crisp and electrified as our armored SUV pulled up to the grand entrance of the Kennedy Center. The building itself was a monument to power and prestige, its massive marble columns illuminated by sweeping spotlights cutting through the Washington night. Tonight, it was dripping in unparalleled opulence. Over 500 guests had begun to arrive, transforming the sweeping plaza into a sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. This was not a standard charity dinner. This was the absolute apex of the city's social calendar, an exclusive gathering of senators, real estate moguls, and the most influential figures within the DC elite HBCU alumni network. I stepped out of the vehicle first, my midnight blue silk gown, catching the flash of dozens of cameras lined along the crimson carpet. I projected an aura of quiet dignity, keeping my expression soft, my posture slightly subdued to sell the illusion of a woman stepping back for the sake of her health. Then Tavon emerged, and the energy shifted. He stepped onto the carpet wearing a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders. The midnight black fabric made him look imposing, untouchable, and entirely predatory. He firmly took his rightful place beside me, sliding a possessive arm around my waist, turning to face the media gauntlet. He looked every inch the conquering king. He drank in the attention, his ego expanding with every camera flash and shouted question from the local press. He smiled his brilliant practiced smile, waving to acquaintances and shaking hands with local dignitaries as we made our slow, deliberate progression down the red carpet. To the outside world, we were the ultimate power couple, presenting a united front as the baton of a massive corporate empire was passed from wife to husband. Taven whispered in my ear, his breath hot against my neck, telling me how perfect the night was going to be. He truly believed the flashes celebrated his ascension. He did not realize they were documenting his final moments of freedom. We moved through the grand foyer, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and imported floral arrangements. The sheer scale of the event was staggering, a testament to the influence I had cultivated over a decade of relentless ambition. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms glided through the crowd, offering crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. The elite clustered in small groups, murmuring about market trends, upcoming legislation, and the anticipated announcement regarding my company. I introduced Tavon to key figures he had only read about in business journals. I watched him inflate his chest, adopting a tone of forced gravitas as he discussed fake visions for urban development and strategic expansion. He was playing the role of a visionary executive with alarming ease, seamlessly lying to men and women who controlled the very fabric of the city. He shook hands with a Maryland senator, confidently discussing zoning regulations he knew absolutely nothing about. He clinked glasses with a prominent venture capitalist, boldly accepting early congratulations on his new role as chief executive officer. His arrogance was a living, breathing entity, feeding on the artificial respect he was receiving. He was entirely consumed by the grand illusion I had built for him. He felt completely untouchable. He truly thought he won the ultimate prize. I quietly stayed by his side, smiling serenely, playing the devoted wife to absolute perfection. I let him have the spotlight, letting his hubris completely blind him to the heavily armed security operatives holding every single exit. While Tavon enchanted the power brokers in the main hall, his family was busy gorging themselves on the lavish extravagance of the evening. I glided through the ornate ballroom, making my way toward the towering 20-tier champagne fountain situated near the center. It was impossible to miss Celeste. She had firmly planted herself exactly where the light hit the crystal hardest, holding court with a group of highly influential women. I recognized the wives of two prominent congressmen and a wealthy federal judge among her captive audience. Celeste was wearing a garish emerald gown that screamed for attention, gesturing wildly with a half-empty glass as she projected her voice over the sophisticated hum of the room. She wanted everyone to hear her. She was determined to rewrite her family's history into a fairy tale of destined corporate royalty. I lingered near a marble pillar close enough to hear her triumphant, boastful performance. She was speaking with aggressive pride, detailing how her brilliant son was finally taking his rightful place at the absolute head of a $100 million empire. She painted a picture of Tavon as a corporate savior, a prodigy stepping in to rescue a fragile, overworked woman from the pressures of leadership. The congressmen's wives nodded politely, their smiles masking their disdain for her sheer volume, but Celeste was completely oblivious to their subtle mockery. She was drowning in her own monumental hubris, bragging about generational wealth she had absolutely no legal claim to. Standing directly beside her was Keisha, looking equally smug and utterly out of place. Keisha was loudly interrupting the conversation to flaunt her wrist, ensuring that every woman in the circle noticed the massive, blindingly bright diamond tennis bracelet she was wearing. It was a spectacular piece of jewelry, practically radiating wealth. I knew the exact specifications of those stones because I had received the bank alert when Keisha purchased it 2 days ago. She had proudly swiped one of the corporate platinum credit cards Tavon had prematurely authorized for her, completely unaware that I was tracking every single fraudulent transaction. They were a pair of absolute fools, drunkenly celebrating their hostile takeover of an empty vault. They thought they had breached the highest echelons of Washington society. They thought they were untouchable elites draped in stolen diamonds and unearned prestige, sipping champagne they could never afford. They were so thoroughly blinded by their greed that they could not see the steel jaws of the trap slowly closing around them. I watched Celeste throw her head back, letting out a sharp, victorious laugh as she toasted her son's supposed financial genius. It was a flawless exhibition of tragic, unearned arrogance. I allowed myself a slow, deeply satisfied smile. Their incredible delusion was the perfect anesthetic. They felt absolutely no pain, no fear, and no suspicion as I systematically stripped away their entire future. Let them drink the expensive champagne. Let them wear the stolen diamonds. Let them brag. The final bill was coming. I detached myself from the marble pillar and began moving through the glittering crowd like a phantom. I was a ghost in my own kingdom, smiling warmly at the guests, softly shaking hands with executives, and playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife, gracefully stepping into the shadows. Every softly spoken word and every demure nod was calculated to reinforce the fragile narrative Tavon was so desperately trying to sell. They looked at me with pity, completely unaware that they were standing in the middle of a meticulously designed kill box. I quietly wove my way through the throngs of laughing dignitaries, keeping my gaze remarkably sharp beneath my calm exterior. On the far side of the massive ballroom, standing near the heavy mahogany doors of the grand entrance, I spotted Vance. He was dressed in a sharp tuxedo that concealed the tactical earpiece resting snugly in his right ear. He stood with the rigid, hyper-vigilant posture of a man commanding an unseen army. Our eyes locked across the sea of celebrating elites. He gave me a single, barely perceptible nod. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his left hand and tapped the face of his watch twice. The silent confirmation sent a thrilling shockwave of adrenaline straight down my spine. The legal traps were primed. The security perimeter was completely sealed. It was exactly time to release the hounds. I turned my attention back to the center of the room, where Taven was still laughing, a fresh glass of bourbon in his hand. The string quartet positioned on the elevated balcony began to play the final sweeping chords of a classical concerto. The music swelled, filling the cavernous space before drawing to a crisp, elegant close. Just as the final note faded into a polite ripple of applause, a sudden, violent commotion erupted at the grand entrance. The heavy mahogany doors were shoved open with explosive, staggering force, slamming loudly against the marble walls. The sophisticated murmur of the gala died, instantly replaced by a collective gasp of shock. The impeccably dressed crowd parted like the Red Sea, scrambling backward to make way for the disruption. Standing in the doorway, her hair wild and her face flushed with absolute unhinged fury, was a heavily pregnant woman. Sasha marched straight into the silent ballroom, her eyes scanning the crowd with lethal intent, screaming Tavon's name at the top of her lungs. "Taven!" Sasha's voice ripped through the stunned silence of the Kennedy Center like a gunshot. The sheer volume of her unexpected scream shattered the delicate illusion of the evening. She stalked forward, her high heels clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor. Her face was a mask of desperation and rage, her mascara running in dark, jagged streaks down her cheeks, staining the collar of her maternity dress. In her trembling right hand, she clutched a thick stack of papers, waving them wildly in the air like a weapon. "Where are you, you lying coward?" she shrieked, her gaze darting wildly across the sea of frozen faces. The hundreds of guests, the senators, the CEOs, the very pinnacle of Washington's elite, stood absolutely paralyzed. The clinking of glasses had ceased. The polite murmurs were extinguished. The entire ballroom descended into a shocked, deathly silence. All eyes were locked on the heavily pregnant woman, violently disrupting the social event of the year. Sasha finally spotted him. Taven was standing near the front of the stage, his charismatic smile melting into an expression of sheer unadulterated terror. He looked as though the floor had vanished beneath his feet. "You promised me!" Sasha screamed, her voice cracking as she marched directly toward the stage, ignoring the gasps of the dignitaries she shoved past. "You promised me $2 million. You told me we were leaving." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not a vague, hysterical outburst. This was a very specific, highly lucrative accusation. "You think you can just liquidate everything, buy a first-class ticket to Dubai, and leave me here holding the bag?" Sasha furiously yelled, shaking the printed flight confirmations and doctored bank statements I had so carefully delivered to her doorstep. "You think you can abandon your unborn son while you run away from Darnell and the people you owe?" The mention of Darnell and massive debts sent a secondary shockwave through the room. The polished facade of the family was cracking wide open in real time. The elite crowd smelling blood in the water reacted with predatory swiftness. Within seconds, 100 cell phones were instantly pulled from tuxedo pockets and designer clutches. Screens illuminated the dim edges of the room as the guests began recording every single second of the spectacle. The high society crowd was capturing the complete and utter destruction of Tavan's carefully crafted public image. Sasha stopped 10 feet from the stage, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured finger directly at Tavan's face. "I am not going down for your mess. I will tell them everything about the syndicate, the money, and the poison. I will burn you to the ground." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every camera lens in the room was fixed on the man who just minutes ago was being crowned the new king of my empire. They waited eagerly for his pathetic response, instantly capturing this spectacular ruin in crisp, ultra-high-definition video. Celeste was standing near the champagne tower when Sasha's voice tore through the ballroom. The haughty, triumphant smile vanished from her powdered face. She jerked sideways in absolute shock, her manicured fingers slipping on the crystal stem of her glass. It tilted dangerously, spilling expensive vintage champagne down the front of her emerald gown, but she did not seem to notice. Her wide eyes were fixated on the pregnant woman marching toward her golden child. The fairy tale she had been loudly bragging about moments prior was disintegrating, and her paralysis morphed into ugly, desperate panic. "Who let this filthy liar inside?" Celeste screeched, her shrill voice slicing through the tension as she dropped the crystal glass onto the marble floor. It shattered with a sharp crash, completely swallowed by the surrounding chaos. "Security, get this crazy woman out of here. She is ruining the evening." Celeste lunged forward, desperately attempting to intercept Sasha before she could hurl any more devastating accusations at the stage. However, she was not the only one reacting. Darnell, whose face had twisted into a mask of pure, lethal fury the second his name and the syndicate were screamed into the public atmosphere, was already in motion. His nightclub empire relied heavily on intimidation and shadow operations, not the unblinking surveillance of 500 recording cell phones. He signaled sharply to Trey, his broad-shouldered enforcer, who had been lingering near the buffet tables. "Grab her and shut her up," Darnell hissed violently, his voice a low, gravelly snarl as he closed the distance. "Drag her out the back exit right now." Trey lunged forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he reached out with thick hands to grab Sasha. Darnell was right beside him, his eyes completely devoid of mercy, ready to silence the liability. Sasha gasped, shrinking back as the two imposing men converged on her, but they never even got close. Before Trey could lay a single finger on her, three enormous men in sharp tactical black suits materialized from the shadows, stepping smoothly between Sasha and the advancing syndicate members. They were part of the elite private security detail I had personally hired and given irrevocable orders. They moved with terrifying precision, forming an impenetrable human wall of solid muscle and Kevlar. The lead operative placed a heavy hand squarely in the center of Trey's chest, stopping his forward momentum instantly. "Back away," the operative commanded, his tone flat and unyielding. Darnell froze, recognizing that these were highly trained contractors who would not hesitate to break bones if provoked. He glared at them, realizing with mounting horror that he was entirely trapped inside the perimeter. From my position, perfectly centered on the elevated stage, I watched the frantic desperation of my in-laws with profound, icy satisfaction. I gracefully stepped forward toward the podium, reaching out to grasp the sleek silver stem of the microphone. I tapped it once, ensuring the audio feed was active. "Stand down," I commanded, my voice projecting clearly through the sound system, echoing ominously off the vaulted ceilings of the Kennedy Center. The amplified sound of my voice instantly froze all the remaining commotion. Darnell glared up at the stage, his face contorted in furious disbelief. Celeste stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth hanging open as she looked at me with wild, terrified eyes. I maintained my posture of calm authority, surveying the fractured remnants of their arrogance. "Let the woman speak," I declared. My tone perfectly even and absolutely chilling. "I want to hear exactly what she has to say right now." Taven was unspooling. The immaculate conquering king from the red carpet had evaporated, replaced by a desperate, sweating coward. It was truly pathetic to witness. He scrambled frantically backward, practically tripping over the expensive microphone cords, as he hauled himself up the small set of stairs onto the main stage. His bespoke tuxedo jacket was now rumpled and large. Dark patches of perspiration were rapidly bleeding through his crisp white dress shirt. "She is lying!" Tavon shouted into his own lapel microphone, his voice echoing with a shrill, panicked tremor that betrayed his absolute guilt. He held his hands up defensively toward the glittering crowd, looking at the hundreds of cell phone cameras currently documenting his total collapse. "Do not listen to her. She is a crazy, obsessed stalker. I have absolutely no idea who this woman is. She is completely deranged." The crowd did not buy a single word. The suffocating silence of the elite audience remained completely unbroken, their judgment hanging heavy in the electrified air. No one rushed to his defense. No one offered a murmur of sympathy. Realizing that his audience had completely turned on him, Tavon spun around to face me. He looked at me with wild, bloodshot eyes, silently pleading for salvation. He needed me to uphold the pristine family image. He needed the powerful, untouchable CEO to shield him from the violent storm. "Simone, please," he begged, his voice dropping into a pathetic, trembling whisper that only the two of us could hear over the ambient hum of the room. "Tell them she is crazy. Tell them to throw her out. You have to fix this." I looked at the man who had secretly planned my funeral while sleeping in my bed. My face was completely devoid of all emotion, a perfectly sculpted mask of frozen marble. I did not offer him a single lifeline. I did not offer him even a single shred of mercy. I simply tilted my head, locking my cold, unforgiving eyes directly with his. I raised my right hand and made a sharp, deliberate gesture toward the tech booth situated high above the crowded ballroom floor. "I do not think she is crazy, Tavon," I said into the microphone, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "But let us look at the tape to be truly sure." The massive 400-inch LED screen behind the stage flickers to life. The massive screen flared with brilliant white light before resolving into a crystal-clear, razor-sharp 4K resolution image. The camera angle was perfect, captured from the discreet security dome Vance had installed directly above our sprawling kitchen island. The audio feed kicked in, sending the ambient hum of our mansion's refrigerator echoing through the state-of-the-art speakers surrounding the Kennedy Center ballroom. The crowd of 500 elites stood absolutely motionless, their faces bathed in the harsh blue glow of the digital projection. On the screen, Tavon sauntered into the frame. He was wearing his favorite cashmere sweater, looking completely relaxed and entirely alone. The ballroom watched in breathless, terrifying horror as my husband whistled a light, upbeat melody. He moved with a sickeningly casual bounce in his step. The camera captured his hands as he picked up two ceramic bowls of steaming soup. He placed them carefully side by side on the polished granite countertop. The cheerful humming continued, a chilling soundtrack to the monstrous act he was about to commit. The high-definition lens zoomed in, slightly guided by Vance's expert remote manipulation from the tech booth. Every senator, every judge, every business mogul in the room had a front-row seat to the betrayal. Tavon checked over his shoulder, a quick, guilty glance toward the hallway to ensure the coast was clear. Finding himself alone, he reached deep into the right pocket of his trousers. His fingers emerged holding a small amber glass vial. A collective shudder rippled through the gala attendees. They watched, paralyzed by the sheer sociopathy unfolding on the massive display. Tavon uncorked the vial with his thumb. Without a single ounce of hesitation, without a tremor in his hand, he tilted the glass rim over the bowl designated for me. A fine white powder cascaded down, dissolving instantly into the hot broth. He tapped the bottom of the vial twice to ensure every last deadly grain of the macadamia extract emptied into my food. He stirred the soup methodically with a silver spoon. He was ensuring his lethal concoction was perfectly mixed, making certain his wife would ingest a fatal dose of an allergen that would constrict her airway and stop her heart. The cheerful tune he hummed never faltered. It was a jaunty, carefree rhythm. He looked like a man making a cup of morning coffee, not a husband executing a premeditated murder. In the ballroom, you could hear a pin drop. The absolute depravity of his casual demeanor struck the crowd like a physical blow. The wealthy benefactors who had just been toasting his ascendance now stared at the screen with undisguised revulsion. Taven stood frozen on the stage beside me, his jaw slack, his eyes bulging as he watched his own monstrous actions broadcast to the very people he had spent years trying to impress. He was trapped in the spotlight he had so desperately craved, entirely unable to look away from his undeniable guilt. He slipped the empty amber vial back into his pocket, picked up the two ceramic bowls, and walked out of the kitchen frame, his jaunty whistling fading slowly into the digital background. The video did not stop. The massive screen flickered momentarily, seamlessly, transitioning to a brand new camera angle fully primed to deliver the next devastating, unvarnished blow to his completely shattered reputation. He believed he had executed the perfect crime, entirely confident that his treacherous actions were hidden from the world. Instead, he was thoroughly exposed, his sinister facade entirely dismantled under the unblinking, blindingly bright glare of public scrutiny. The digital feed skipped forward, landing on the high-definition security footage captured inside our formal dining room. The camera perfectly framed the long, polished mahogany table where my father-in-law, Judge Roland, sat eagerly waiting for his meal. The entire ballroom held its breath as the scene played out. On the massive screen, my own figure entered the frame, carrying the two steaming bowls of soup from the kitchen. The guests watched intently as I approached the table. With a swift, flawlessly executed sleight of hand, I smoothly swapped the poisoned bowl intended for me with the untainted bowl meant for the judge. It was a rapid, silent exchange of porcelain, capturing the exact moment I redirected Taven's lethal trap. The visual narrative then accelerated, jumping ahead to the horrifying conclusion of the meal. The ambient sound of polite dining room chatter filled the Kennedy Center, creating a jarring juxtaposition against the impending tragedy. Suddenly, the audio spiked, with a harsh, suffocating wheeze. On the 400-inch display, Judge Roland's hands flew to his throat. His face flushed a deep, terrifying crimson as his airway violently constricted. He knocked over his wineglass, the dark red liquid spilling across the white tablecloth like a grim premonition. The footage was completely unedited, brutally raw, and undeniably graphic. It documented every agonizing second of the older man's sudden, catastrophic decline. He thrashed against his chair, his eyes wide with uncomprehending terror as the stolen poison ravaged his system. A collective, deafening gasp tore through the 500 attendees. Men in tuxedos recoiled in absolute shock. Women covered their mouths, their eyes locked on the undeniable proof of patricide being broadcast above them. The sheer horror of the visual evidence paralyzed the elite crowd. They were watching a murder unfold, recognizing the victim as the beloved patriarch of the Rowland family. Then a sound completely unlike any other ripped through the vast ballroom. It was a guttural, soul-tearing shriek of pure, unadulterated agony. Celeste fell to her knees near the shattered remains of her champagne glass. Her hands clawed desperately at her own face, tearing at her hair. As the horrifying reality finally crushed her delusional hubris, she stared up at the screen, watching her husband choke to death on the macadamia extract. The devastating truth obliterated her entire world. The son she had worshipped, the boy she had constantly elevated above all others, the man she believed was destined for absolute greatness, was the exact person who had brutally murdered her husband. She wailed a high-pitched, keening sound that echoed endlessly off the acoustic panels. She collapsed onto the marble floor, violently trembling completely, broken by the revelation that her golden child had unwittingly executed his own father in a botched attempt to slaughter me. The opulent crowd watched her writhe in despair, unsympathetic to the matriarch who had spent the evening boasting about her murderous offspring. The pristine illusion was permanently broken into jagged, bloody pieces. Before Tavon could muster the strength to run, the massive screen shifted abruptly. The horrific dining room scene dissolved, replaced immediately by the crisp, brightly lit footage captured by the hidden lens Vance had placed inside the private study. The audio feed crackled with the clinking of heavy crystal glasses as Tavon and his older brother Darnell dominated the frame. They were leaning against the expensive leather furniture, looking entirely too comfortable, completely unbothered by the fact that their father was currently lying in a hospital bed, clinging to life. "He's basically a vegetable anyway." Tavon's voice boomed through the Kennedy Center, dripping with a cold, callous arrogance. On the screen, he took a long, lazy sip of his bourbon. "The doctors say there's zero brain activity. It's just a matter of time before we pull the plug." Darnell laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed wickedly across the shocked ballroom. "Good. The sooner he flatlines, the sooner that insurance policy pays out. $5 million clears my debt, little brother. Then we're free and clear to take the rest." There was absolutely no denying the chilling, premeditated malice radiating from the speakers. The pristine family image, the carefully cultivated facade of respectability and old money sophistication, was utterly annihilated in front of the entire city. The political elites, the wealthy investors, and the influential alumni who had gathered to celebrate their rise were now the definitive witnesses to their grotesque depravity. The room rippled with visceral disgust. Whispers of horror transformed into loud, angry condemnations as the guests pointed toward the stage, their recording devices capturing the undeniable, staggering truth of the Rowland family's criminal corruption. Taven's eyes darted frantically around the room, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his exposure. Panic finally snapped his paralysis. He spun around, abandoning his frozen, desperately sobbing mother, and desperately tried to sprint toward the stage exit located in the rear shadows. He barely made it 3 frantic, stumbling steps before he was met by a solid, immovable wall of heavily armed, unyielding private security guards. The imposing elite operatives stood perfectly shoulder to shoulder, their hands resting firmly on their tactical belts, blocking any possible avenue of escape. I slowly raised the silver microphone to my lips once again, my amplified voice effortlessly cutting through the rising panic and chaotic screaming of the crowd like a serrated, icy blade. "I'm not finished. You wanted my company, Tavon." I let the question hang in the cold, electrified air of the ballroom. The frantic scrambling of my former husband ceased as he stared at the wall of security contractors. He slowly turned back to face me, his chest heaving, his face a mask of absolute despair. I raised my hand, signaling the tech booth again. The horrific footage of Judge Rowland vanished from the large display screen, instantly replaced by a dizzying array of complex financial documents, bank transfers, and legally binding corporate contracts. The bold black letters of his signature were magnified for every single guest to witness. You thought you were outsmarting me. I continued, my voice echoing with unrelenting authority. You thought you could step into my shoes, take the throne I built with my own blood and sweat, and simply erase me from the narrative. You signed those transition papers with such eager, unthinking greed. You celebrated your ascension. You wore the custom tuxedo. You drank the vintage champagne. But you never bothered to actually read the fine print, did you, Tavon? You were too blinded by your own monumental hubris. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the stage. The elite crowd watched in rapt, silent fascination as the corporate execution unfolded. Let me explain exactly what you signed, I declared, pointing to the glowing display screen. You did not inherit a massive real estate and development empire. I meticulously restructured the entire organization over the past 6 months. I legally transferred every single performing asset, every lucrative contract, and every piece of valuable intellectual property into a completely separate holding company, safely under my exclusive control. The entity you proudly took over today, the one bearing your name as sole chief executive officer, is nothing but a hollow, rotting shell. His weak knees buckled slightly. He gripped the edge of the podium to keep from collapsing, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. That shell corporation, I stated, twisting the knife with precise, calculated cruelty, currently holds exactly $40 million in highly toxic, completely unrecoverable debt. I dumped every bad investment, every failing property, and every looming liability into that single entity. And by signing those transition papers yesterday morning, you assumed full, unmitigated personal liability for every single penny of it. The sheer magnitude of the financial ruin washed over the crowd. Murmurs of shock rippled through the sea of wealthy investors and politicians. They understood the lethal nature of the trap better than anyone. You are completely bankrupt, Tavon, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy register. But financial ruin is just the beginning. I also made sure to route several highly questionable, heavily scrutinized offshore transactions directly through your new executive accounts. The Securities and Exchange Commission has been tracking those specific funds for weeks. You do not have an empire. You have a massive federal indictment for corporate fraud waiting for you. You will spend the rest of your natural life rotting in a federal penitentiary, drowning in debt you can never possibly repay. Tavon let out a pathetic, suffocating whimper. The realization of his total annihilation stripped away the last remaining shreds of his carefully cultivated bravado. He sank to the floor of the stage, a broken, ruined man. He buried his face in his trembling hands, openly weeping, as the absolute certainty of his permanent destruction crushed his remaining spirit. There would be no escape, no clever legal maneuvering, and absolutely no mercy for his countless crimes, sealing his own grim fate forever in this room. I turned my glacial stare away from my weeping husband and locked my eyes directly onto his older brother. Darnell was still standing frozen on the ballroom floor, completely surrounded by my highly trained security operatives. The heavy, intimidating aura he usually projected had completely vanished, replaced by an unmistakable, mounting terror. I slowly descended the plush, carpeted stairs of his grand stage, my midnight blue gown brushing softly against the marble tiles. The sea of wealthy elites seamlessly parted eagerly, clearing a wide, unobstructed path for me as I purposefully approached the syndicate boss. "And you, Darnell?" I said, my voice dangerously soft, yet piercingly clear through the advanced microphone. "You honestly thought you could effortlessly use my life to quietly pay off your massive underworld debts. You thought you could simply arrange an unfortunate, tragic accident for me, collect the massive corporate insurance payouts, and satisfy the incredibly dangerous people you owe money to." I stopped a few feet away from him, observing the sweat beading on his forehead. "You vastly underestimated my reach. I did not just discover your pathetic assassination plot. I systematically mapped out every single one of your closely guarded financial vulnerabilities. I learned exactly who held your markers. Then I bought them, every last one of them." His dark eyes widened in absolute shock, his jaw dropping as the devastating reality of my words slowly registered. That is right, I confirmed, relishing the utter devastation blooming across his face. I am now your sole exclusive creditor. I own the paper on your 3 luxury nightclubs. I own the deeds to your extensive fleet of exotic cars. I own the mortgage on your sprawling waterfront home. I own your entire existence, Darnell. And unlike the generous banks you usually defraud, I do not offer extensions, grace periods, or renegotiated terms. I paused, allowing the agonizing silence to stretch, ensuring that every guest in the room grasped the total magnitude of his ruin. In fact, I continued, checking the elegant diamond watch resting on my wrist. The official, legally binding foreclosure notices were physically served to your management staff exactly 10 minutes ago. Your nightclubs have been permanently shuttered and padlocked. Your luxury vehicles are currently being seized and impounded by professional recovery teams. Your waterfront mansion is surrounded by private security contractors who are currently changing every single lock on the property. You are entirely homeless, completely penniless, and absolutely devoid of any remaining underworld influence. You have absolutely nothing left. Darnell let out a ragged, choking gasp. The formidable syndicate boss, a man who had built an entire career on brutal intimidation and ruthless power, physically crumbled before my eyes. He fell heavily to his knees on the cold marble floor, violently clutching his shaved head with both hands. He let out a low guttural moan of sheer disbelief, rocking back and forth as the crushing weight of his instantaneous poverty and total humiliation destroyed his soul, leaving his entire empire in ashes. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a sudden, frantic, desperate movement near the grand, heavy mahogany doors. Keisha, who had been aggressively flaunting her newly acquired diamonds all evening, was desperately attempting to sneak away. She had discarded her high heels, tiptoeing frantically toward the dimly lit exit, hoping to vanish into the Washington night before her own severe consequences could be delivered. Keisha! I called out, my voice slicing through the thick tension of the ballroom like a sharpened blade. She froze instantly, her shoulders stiffening as hundreds of judging eyes immediately pivoted to lock onto her trembling frame. She slowly turned around to face my wrath, clutching her glittering wrist, looking like a trapped animal caught in the blinding glare of a spotlight. "Did you really believe you could simply walk away?" I asked, my tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. "You have been joyfully swiping corporate platinum credit cards for the past 3 weeks. You thought you had struck gold, completely unaware that I was personally monitoring every single fraudulent, wildly exorbitant transaction. The spectacular diamond tennis bracelet currently sitting on your wrist is not a gift. It is a highly documented felony. The Metropolitan Police are already waiting right outside those doors to arrest you for multiple counts of grand larceny. Those credit cards were never yours." Keisha let out a pathetic, stifled sob, shrinking against the marble wall, as the inescapable reality of her impending imprisonment paralyzed her completely. I surveyed the magnificent, glittering room. The entire disgraced family was firmly pinned to the stage, and the surrounding floor hopelessly trapped by the inescapable consequences of their own ravenous greed and monumental hubris. Tavon wept on the stage, completely ruined. Darnell kneeled on the marble, stripped of his criminal power. Celeste remained shattered by the horrific death of her husband. Keisha stood frozen, awaiting her inevitable arrest. They were stripped entirely bare, standing completely naked and vulnerable before the very elite society they had so desperately tried to infiltrate and blindly rule. The perfect, untouchable facade they had built was entirely eradicated, replaced by the ugly, undeniable truth of their countless unforgivable crimes, leaving them completely destroyed and destined for absolute ruin. The heavy mahogany doors to the ballroom open once more. Vance enters, leading a squad of D.C. Metropolitan Police detectives, federal agents, and the district attorney. The room flashes with police sirens. Federal agents swarmed the ballroom floor with synchronized lethal efficiency. The red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside strobed violently through the grand windows, casting harsh shadows across the terrified faces of the Washington elite. Detective Ramirez, a hardened veteran, I had been secretly coordinating with for 3 weeks marched straight onto the stage. He did not hesitate. He grabbed Tavon roughly by the shoulder and slammed him against the acrylic podium. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around my husband's wrists echoed loudly through the sound system. Ramirez leaned in close, reading Tavon his rights with a booming, authoritative cadence. He officially charged him with attempted murder, felony insurance fraud, and massive corporate malfeasance. Tavon sobbed hysterically, his knees buckling, as two officers hauled him upright. Below the stage, a parallel takedown was occurring. Darnell did not even fight back. He remained kneeling on the marble floor, completely catatonic, as federal agents secured his wrists. They formally charged him with extensive money laundering and federal racketeering, dismantling his entire criminal syndicate in a matter of seconds. Keisha shrieked as a female officer clamped handcuffs on her, roughly confiscating the stolen diamond tennis bracelet right off her wrist. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as the once arrogant family was systematically rounded up like common street thugs. The officers began to drag Tavon toward the main exit. He twisted violently in their grip, his dress shirt torn, his face slick with sweat and tears. He locked his desperate bloodshot eyes on me one final time. He looked pathetic, silently pleading with me to save him from the devastating reality he had built for himself. He wanted the powerful CEO to wave her hand and make the nightmare disappear. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, the undisputed victor of this brutal war. I did not flinch. I did not frown. I simply picked up a fresh crystal flute of vintage champagne from a nearby silver tray. I turned my back entirely on the weeping man who had tried to murder me. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the crisp wine, completely ignoring his agonizing screams as the heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind him. The grand show was officially over and the magnificent stage was now entirely mine. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my soul completely. 6 months later, the fallout was absolute. The once mighty family had been reduced to nothing but ash. Tavon was swiftly denied bail, designated a severe flight risk due to the overwhelming, undeniable video evidence against him. He was currently sitting in a Stark federal holding facility, facing a mandatory sentence of 30 years to life in prison. He had lost everything. Darnell's criminal empire collapsed entirely. The government seized every single remaining asset he possessed, leaving him and Keisha completely bankrupt. She was forced to trade her stolen diamonds for a cheap synthetic jumpsuit. Celeste's precious social standing vanished overnight. She was publicly outed as an active accomplice who deliberately attempted to cover up the horrific poisoning. The Washington elite completely ostracized her, treating her like a toxic pariah. Stripped of her unearned wealth and prestige, she was legally forced to move into a cramped, dismal, low-income apartment on the forgotten outskirts of the city. Judge Rowland never fully recovered from the neurotoxin. He remained perpetually trapped on a humming life support machine in a bleak, state-funded care facility surrounded by peeling paint instead of imported marble. His legacy was permanently stained by the treachery of his own bloodline. Sasha successfully delivered her baby boy. She was currently living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surviving solely off a modest, deeply hidden financial stipend I had anonymously established. It was just enough money to ensure the innocent child survived, but the accounts were heavily monitored. Every single transaction was tracked by my security team to ensure she never attempted to reach out or cause trouble again. The vicious parasites had been systematically exterminated, their unearned privileges completely revoked. They were left to rot in the very gutter they had so desperately tried to escape. They would never bother me again. The final scene cuts to a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse overlooking the magnificent Manhattan skyline. The afternoon sun bathed the opulent office in a warm golden glow. I sat comfortably behind a massive polished oak desk, meticulously reviewing the intricate blueprints for a brand new billion-dollar urban development project. The empire was expanding completely unfettered by dead weight. The heavy mahogany door swung open. Vance walked in his sharp suit, impeccably tailored. He carried a sleek leather folder, placing it gently on the center of my desk. Inside rested the finalized, irrevocable divorce decrees and the absolute legal deeds to all of the seized Washington properties. The last remaining legal tethers to my fraudulent past had finally been severed. I picked up my favorite gold fountain pen and signed my name across the bottom of each document with a smooth, perfectly steady hand. The satisfying scratch of the metal nib against the thick parchment felt like the ultimate victory lap. "Everything is completely finalized, ma'am," Vance murmured respectfully, giving a slight affirming nod. I closed the leather folder, pushing it back across the desk. I stood up and slowly walked toward the towering windows. Blood may be thicker than water, but it is also much easier to clean up once you know how to wield the mop. I looked out over the sprawling, limitless city, below the undisputed queen of a vast, untouchable empire. The treacherous ghosts of the past were entirely buried, replaced by the brilliant, glittering promise of absolute power. I let out a long, quiet breath, watching the tiny vehicles navigate the distant, busy streets. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the sun against my face. I was completely unburdened, entirely victorious, and finally at peace. The glorious future was completely mine. I had definitively won the war. The ultimate lesson from this narrative is that unchecked hubris always engineers its own spectacular downfall. True power does not roar. It observes silently, meticulously gathering every agonizing detail before striking with absolute precision. When arrogant antagonists confuse quiet observation with weakness, they blindly construct their own inescapable traps. For anyone crafting compelling tales of betrayal and calculated justice, this serves as a masterclass in pacing a protagonist's vengeance. The most devastating destruction requires no physical violence, only the cold, unyielding revelation of truth and the strategic dismantling of a stolen empire. Greed blinds the foolish, but patience crowns queens. Subscribe today to explore more gripping stories where unchecked greed meets ultimate justice.